however perceived, however understood, what other factors, we'll never know. But we see a pattern that took place in Morocco under Hassan II, with Boumediene in Algeria after he took over in 1965, until he died in 1978 because of cancer. Then his successor, Chedli Ben Jadid, also a military man, acted more or less the same way. And in the case of Tunisia, for sure, with Ben Ali. What comes together? Personality, economics, wars, the Cold War, the role of the military in the case of Algeria, you could say the same in the case of Egypt, and increasingly the emergence of Islamic political movements that end up being used as justifications for the intensification of authoritarian practices and policies. These come together and create a new profile of the area, which is simply put authoritarian in nature, despotic in some cases, maintained by a combination of coercion and a certain amount of consensus, but more coercion than consensus, while all along, to the extent possible economically, maintaining the social welfare and the kind of social contract that more or less had been agreed upon, not in a formal documentary way, but in an informal way, which essentially said, you know, I'll take care of your education, I'll subsidize your housing, I'll provide you with cheap health care, you simply accept and acquiesce to my governance and my party and so forth. It's a deal that, you know, a lot of people could live with, especially if opportunities were difficult in the private sector. Ironically, but historically and comparatively, it was clear that what the North African leaderships were doing was not that much different than what other leaderships in other authoritarian countries in other parts of the world were doing. They were creating a civil society that was becoming increasingly educated, increasingly politically aware, increasingly politically conscious, not only of their own situation, but within the region and the world as a whole. This was happening with a vengeance in the case of the Middle East and North Africa. And it isn't just simply a question of poverty or overpopulation. Tunisia is not overpopulated. It has one of the lowest birth rates in the region and indeed in the world. So it wasn't just about overpopulation, or it wasn't just simply about, you know, overeducated and underemployed. These are important. There's no question about it. Nor was it just simply about the global economic crisis impacting on these local economies, to be sure. But the economic dimension appears more in terms of the way in which it is associated with the corruption and crony capitalism that the regimes and the leaders were maintaining, which were being perceived correctly for the most part, taking place at the expense of society, which meant at the expense of the Tunisian people, the Algerian people, and the Moroccan people. Now this was a process that had been going on for a while. And those of us who have been studying North Africa had always commented, you know, how long can a state and a society move apart from each other and sort of make so thin the basis of legitimacy that the regime would, at the end of the day, have to use force as the only way by which it could maintain its so-called legitimacy. Clearly, countries like Algeria or even Libya that have oil and gas always had that as a source of legitimacy that others might not have, and that could sort of redistribute goods at the time when they believed that the legitimacy was declining. But that in and itself was inadequate. So simply put, as we move through the decades after independence, we saw governments and leaders promoting particular ideologies that resonated for the most part with the citizenry. The government, for its part, promoting economic and social policies that for the most part benefited people, not as fast, not as far, and quantitatively not as deep as, for example, what happened in Asia. And when the comparison is made with the Asian tigers, for example, the Middle East is always shown to be, significantly at the short end of that comparison. So by the time you get to, and here it's very difficult to pinpoint particular dates or events, and I think there's a danger to that. As this consensus begins to crumble, as this social contract is less and less viable, then the cracks begin to appear. And they appear in ways that, for the most of the world, were unaware were beginning to deepen. Namely, strikes, demonstrations, riots, all kinds of social activity, never enough to challenge the authority of the state, but to demonstrate that civil society was beginning to act on its grievances. And again, unless it involved a terrorist attack, unless it involved a war, unless it involved a coup d'etat, most of the world was pretty much ignoring these kinds of developments. Even as we're talking now, Algeria has demonstrations and strikes on a daily basis, daily basis. Some turn violent. Some involve hunger strikes, as is in the case down in the gas fields where the Sonatrach workers have been on a hunger strike for 10 days because they're unhappy with the increase in salaries that the government is offering them. But the point I want to make is that if we had been looking more carefully and closely at the society as a whole, we would have been aware of a couple of things. One, yes, the formal structure of authority remained highly authoritarian. One party, the military, the security apparatus, the media controlled, and so on and so forth. At another level, there were ways in which citizens would try to articulate their grievances and their differences that wouldn't challenge that authority directly, otherwise it may send them to jail or worse. But additionally, there was a certain amount of activism and protest that took place. Now remember, if you're an ordinary Algerian or Tunisian or Moroccan, and you're not from the elite, and you don't have connections, and you can't pay people off, and you're confronted with these kinds of increasingly limited opportunities that present themselves. Remember, the more educated you are, the more certified you are, the higher expectations about the kinds of jobs that you would get. Totally, I think, understandable. The choices before you were fairly few. Now, one of them, an extremely important one, which can help explain why these events happened when they did and not earlier, was exit. You get the hell out. You go to Europe. You go to Europe, which has always been an important pipeline for both sides. One, for cheap labor in Europe, and the other side to get rid of this excess population that you can't employ and who may be revolutionary fodder. So this was an important element that helps explain this sort of the tardiness of this. Another, of course, was just to shut the hell up and go home and just concentrate on your private life and do as best as you can. A third was to face the regime up front and confront either, imprisonment, torture, death. Very few were willing to do that. Others would join extremist movements. These are our candidates for Al-Qaeda. These are the dudes who say, that's it. I'm not going to Europe. Europe doesn't even want me anymore as things begin to change. I'm going to be, if I make any attempt on the public front, they're going to put me in jail and kill me. And this, for me, is a logical option when I look at the limited number of options I have available. Now, this is not to suggest large numbers, but I think it is important in light of what happens afterwards for those who might be interested in understanding the nexus between terrorism and democracy, or between terrorism and freedom, and terrorism and social opportunity, and terrorism and the sense that people have a voice in the decisions that affect their lives. Understood in this context, I think one could appreciate this relationship. So when those choices were available, and they're pretty depressing, oh, of course, to be co-opted. You just get co-opted. And in Tunisia, there were like 150,000 co-opted taxi drivers who served as security people. Whatever hotel you went to, for any taxi driver, you could be sure he went back and reported who you were, what you were, where you went, what you were doing, and so on and so forth. I'm convinced, and I'd like somebody to confirm otherwise. It's easy enough to say it, right, because it's impossible to empirically verify. But I'm convinced every taxi driver in the Tunis and Carthage and Sidi Boud area was an informant, one way or another. There's no, because there was money to be made. Money, not much. I mean, my experience is many times seeing some of my Islamist colleagues who were, you know, serious, not terrorist, you know, sincere about their commitment to a political process that they believed had, you know, an Islamic component. I didn't have to agree with it, but I did respect their opinions, and they would be wonderful hosts. They would invite me and so on and so forth. There would always be these dudes following me all over the place. It was so sad, you know. I said, you can go home. I'm just a little professor. I'm not important. Really, nothing's going to happen. And they would follow me all day long. We'd go out to dinner. They'd be in the car behind and so on and so forth. I mean, at the end of the day, you just don't take it very seriously, but you figure, well, you know, I'm a foreigner. But what happens if you're a Tunisian and you don't have resources connected? And they're not so nice to you. They beat the hell out of you. So I could walk away, get back on the plane, laugh about it, and even give a lecture about it. But my colleagues back there, you know, all kinds of things happen to them. So you see now, I mean, a society and a state that have reached such a point of disjuncture that we simply ask, when is the outburst going to take place? We surely would never know how, and that I think is understandable. But when? And we had all kinds of scenarios, classic scenarios, coup d'etat. Enlightened military man, if that's not an oxymoron. But nevertheless, you know, enlightened military man would stage a coup, throw out the dictator, and insert, you know, like the Turkish model, more or less, kind of thing. That was one model. The idea of a revolution, but you know, when you think of revolutions in the modern period, I mean, you think of China, possibly, or you think of Vietnam, you think of Cuba. You know, as Americans, I don't think I like that kind of revolution. Maybe that's a bit too much, you know. And we always thought of democracy as something maybe that could sort of evolve, you know. We would invest enormous amount of money in different NGOs and teaching democracy, teach them elections and so on and so forth. Of course, these governments and these leaders, savvy as they were, I mean, they don't stay in power as long as they do, just, you know, if they were totally stupid, just partly stupid, but not totally stupid. And among the way they would do it is, democracy? You want democracy? I'll give you democracy. How many elections do you want? I'll give you all the elections you want. Candidates? I got candidates. Issues? I've got issues. Outcomes guaranteed. Leader stays in power. And then your US-supported NGO, you say, well, what do you want now? You wanted elections? You got elections. You want parties? We got parties. You want, you know, civil society? We got tons of civil society organizations and so forth. So it was hard to predict if, you know, on one level this is happening from the kind of democratic evolutionary side. The military side all seemed problematic because we knew the military was very much allied to those in power in any case. A true revolution hardly ever occurs throughout history in any case, so that surely wasn't going to happen. What we never expected was a genuinely populist uprising of young people Twittering and Facebooking and putting up signs in Arabic, French, and English for the world to see, to which they're then connecting to their fellow dudes in Egypt. I mean, so here we're thinking, we're the West, we're the technologically savvy society, we're the Google people, we're the Microsoft, we're the Apple, so forth. They are light years ahead of us, light years ahead of us. I'm not exaggerating on that point for those of you who know the area.